They had names, they had families. They lived in a world that, according to the oldest records of humanity, was spiraling into something without precedent. And then something arrived, not from the earth. And what was born from that union was so disturbing that the Creator himself decided to restart everything. To understand who these women were, you first need to understand the world in which they lived, a world that most people have never been taught to imagine correctly. The period between the creation of Adam and the flood was not an era of primitive huts and ignorant peoples wandering through forests. The biblical records suggest the opposite. Genesis tells us that only a few generations after Adam there were already cities, metallurgy, music, advanced agriculture, and organized livestock breeding. Cain built a city and named it after his son. Jubal played the harp and flute. Tubal-Cain forged instruments of bronze and iron. This was not a civilization in its infancy. It was a civilization in accelerated expansion, in full technological and cultural flourishing centuries before the flood. And the population was growing at an impressive rate. The pre-Diluvian patriarchs lived hundreds of years. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912. Methuselah, the longest lived of all, reached 969 years before dying, in the very same year as the flood, according to the calculation of the genealogies. Mathematicians and demographers who have studied these numbers seriously have estimated that the human population before the flood may have reached hundreds of millions of people. Some even estimate that the pre-Diluvian world harbored more than 1 billion human beings, a vast populous world constantly evolving technologically and in accelerated spiritual collapse. Genesis 5 traces a silent and heavy genealogy. Each name is followed by the same phrase, "and he died." The repetition has a cumulative effect that the text creates in a completely deliberate manner. Generation after generation, the shadow of death advanced over a species that had been created for eternity. And at some point, within those hundreds of years of pre-Diluvian history, something began to change in the relationship between the visible and the invisible world. Something that no genealogy could record, that no name could capture, that the sacred text itself only describes in 4 verses, but 4 verses that change the course of everything. Genesis 6 begins with a clinical objectivity that makes the statement even more disturbing. The text says, "When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took for themselves wives from all they chose." The passage continues. "In those days there were giants on the earth, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." 4 verses, 2 groups of beings, 1 union, and descendants that the Bible describes as mighty men and men of renown. Words that in the Hebrew version carry connotations of power, of fame, and of something that the text clearly does not present as a positive development for the history of humanity. The debate surrounding this passage revolves around a question that has divided theologians and researchers for millennia. Who were the sons of God? The oldest interpretation, documented in pre-Christian Jewish writings, in the texts of the Second Temple, in the Septuagint, in intertestamental literature, and in the early church fathers, identifies the sons of God as angelic beings. The Hebrew expression used in the text is Bene ha-Elohim, literally sons of the gods or sons of the divine being. The same expression appears in other parts of the Old Testament. In Job chapter 1 verse 6, the sons of God present themselves before the Lord together with Satan. In Job chapter 38 verse 7, the text describes the sons of God shouting for joy when the earth was created. The context of these passages is clearly angelic. These are not human beings presenting themselves in a divine council. They are beings of a different nature, participants in a reality that predates the creation of humanity. This angelic interpretation dominated Jewish thought for centuries. The Book of Enoch is explicit on this point. The Dead Sea Scrolls refer to these beings in a way that permits no ambiguity. The Book of Jubilees, a text from the Second Temple period, narrates the same story with additional details. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, reports that many angels of God united with women and begat sons who proved insolent and disdainful of every good. The Apostle Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch in verse 14 of his letter. Peter, in his second epistle, chapter 2, verse 4, specifically mentions the angels who sinned and who were delivered into chains of darkness, language that corresponds directly to the narrative of the Watchers in Enoch. The so-called Sethite interpretation emerged later, gaining traction from the writings of Julius Africanus in the 3rd century of the Christian era and of Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. It proposes that the sons of God were the pious descendants of Seth, and that the daughters of men were women of the corrupted lineage of Cain. But this interpretation finds no support in the oldest available texts, and the expression Bene ha-Elohim is simply not used anywhere else in the Hebrew Scriptures to refer to human beings regardless of their piety. There is also the ruler interpretation, which identifies the sons of God as kings and powerful men of the ancient Near East who took women by force. It has cultural coherence, but faces the same problem. It is not how the oldest readers of the text understood it. When you go to the oldest available sources, the texts that most closely approximate the world in which Genesis was written, preserved by the communities that took the integrity of the Scriptures most seriously, the angelic interpretation dominates in a way that simply finds no real competition. And it is in this oldest layer that the story of the women of Genesis 6 begins to acquire a depth that goes far beyond any superficial interpretation. The Book of Enoch is the document that details this narrative with the most specific richness. Although it is not in the Protestant or Catholic biblical canon, it was widely read and respected in the Second Temple period. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means that the community of Qumran, those who preserved the sacred texts with obsessive devotion, copying each letter with religious meticulousness, considered this book important enough to include in their sacred library. Multiple copies were found in different languages: Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. This indicates that the text circulated widely and was respected across different traditions. What the Book of Enoch narrates is the following: 200 angelic beings, described as watchers. The word in Hebrew is irin, guardians, observers, those designated to watch, descended upon Mount Hermon. This mountain is approximately 2,800 meters in altitude and is located in the region that today corresponds to the border between Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. Its name in Hebrew, Shermon, derives from a root meaning sacred, consecrated or forbidden, set apart for a specific purpose. The geographical irony is too heavy to be ignored. A mountain whose very name means forbidden was chosen as the point of descent for beings who were about to cross the most forbidden boundary that existed in creation. The Book of Enoch describes how these 200 made a collective oath on Mount Hermon, a pact of shared responsibility, because the transgression they were about to commit was so grave, so irreversible in its consequences, that none of them wanted to do it alone. The text describes Semyaza, the leader of the group, saying to the others, "I fear that you may not indeed be willing to carry out this deed, and I alone will bear the guilt of this great sin." And the others responded, Let us all swear an oath and bind one another with curses not to abandon this plan, but to carry out this purpose." After that, they all swore together and were bound by the oath. The names of the leaders are preserved in the text with the meticulousness of those who want to make clear that these were not abstract forces. Semyaza led. Azazel would be responsible for the most destructive transmissions of knowledge. Armaros, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Sarakiel, each with their name, their identity, their specific responsibility in what was about to happen. They were individuals making a deliberate choice, with full awareness of the boundaries they were crossing, and then they descended, and they found the women. What motivated beings of this nature to cross a boundary of such magnitude? This is one of the questions the ancient texts leave partially open. The Book of Enoch describes the watchers seeing the daughters of men and desiring them. The word the text uses is charged with intention. It was not chance, not involuntary tropism. It was deliberate will, and the decision to act on that desire was, as we have seen, collective and sworn, which suggests that these beings had full awareness of what they were doing. They knew it was forbidden, they knew the consequences, and they did it anyway. In the pre-Diluvian world, the memory of creation was far more recent than we can imagine. Adam was still alive when the 9th generation of descendants was beginning to be born. Oral tradition was the primary means of transmitting knowledge, and the memory of a world where God walked in the garden in the cool of the day was not distant legend. It was recent history, transmitted by voices that had heard it from voices that had lived it. In such a world, the awareness of the supernatural was immediate and visceral in ways we can no longer calibrate. The arrival of beings of a different nature, who manifested something transcendent in their very physical presence, would have had a psychological impact that is difficult to describe with our contemporary language. The text of Genesis uses the verb tuk, vayikchu in Hebrew, the same word used to describe marriage in other biblical contexts. This has led some scholars to argue that there was some element of consent or choice in these unions. Others point out that taking women was an expression that frequently implied power and social dominance, not emotional reciprocity. The text does not elaborate. The silence surrounding the perspective of the women in this narrative is absolute, and that silence is itself a form of information about how the ancient world recorded stories in which the voices of women were simply not considered relevant to the official record of events. What we can infer with reasonable certainty is that these women were distributed throughout an immense world. The expression "daughters of men" used in Genesis is the most encompassing possible. This suggests that the phenomenon described in Genesis 6 was not a localized event in a single region. The scale of the subsequent corruption, which reached the point of causing God to declare that all flesh had corrupted its way, indicates that what happened was not an isolated incident. It was something that spread in different degrees and forms throughout an entire world. What happened after these unions was what transformed the history of the pre-Diluvian world in a way that had no precedent. The Book of Enoch divides the consequences into two main axes. The first was technological and spiritual, the forbidden knowledge that the Watchers taught to humanity. The second was biological, the children born of these unions. According to Enoch, each of the leading Watchers was responsible for revealing to humanity a specific type of knowledge that human beings should not have received at that stage of their history. Azazel taught men how to make swords, shields, knives, and breastplates, the working of metals in technical detail. And he taught women the use of ornaments, cosmetics, dyes, and the beautification of the body for purposes of seduction. The metallurgy that allowed the creation of survival tools also revealed how to create weapons of destruction. The beautification that could be an expression of dignity was instrumentalized for manipulation. Other watchers taught enchantments and sorcery. They taught how to cut roots and the science of plants for manipulation. They taught astrology, divination, and how to interpret natural phenomena to obtain power over others. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the signs of the stars. Each area of knowledge was, in itself, potentially neutral, but in the hands of a civilization that had lost its moral foundation, each revelation became one more tool of destruction and oppression. The effect on human society was catastrophic in a specific way, not because knowledge itself is always destructive, but because it was delivered prematurely to beings who lacked the moral maturity to manage it. It is like placing control of a devastating force in the hands of someone who has never grasped the concept of responsibility. The tool is not the problem. The absence of discernment to use it is what transforms knowledge into destruction. Violence exploded on a scale never seen before. The text of Genesis 6 verse 11 says that the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. Uro, the Hebrew word for violence, there is chamas, which implies boundless brutality, structural oppression, physical and moral harm on a civilizational scale. It was not episodic conflict between tribes. It was an entire civilization that had lost any moral reference capable of restraining its worst impulses. And at the center of this descending spiral were the children born of the forbidden unions, the Nephilim. The Hebrew word is etymologically debated. It may derive from nephal, to fall, suggesting those who fell or those begotten by the fallen ones. It may simply mean giants, as the Greek Septuagint translates. The text of Genesis 6 verse 4 describes them as Gibborim, the mighty, the powerful, and as Anashe Hashem, literally men of the name, men whose fame spread beyond the limits of their own territory. The Book of Enoch goes into details that Genesis deliberately omits. The Nephilim were giants, creatures of proportions that exceeded any human scale. They were of mixed nature, neither completely angelic nor completely human, and carried within themselves a fundamental contradiction, the body of earthly origin with a supernatural component that could never be completely at peace with the limitations of the material world. The result was an insatiability that the text describes with words that sound terrible in any language. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And when men no longer sufficed for them, they turned against the animals, the birds, the reptiles, and the fish. And they also turned against one another to eat their flesh and drink their blood. An entire civilization being literally consumed by the creatures born of its own mingling with the supernatural. And all of this spreading through a world that had hundreds of millions of inhabitants, that had cities, trade routes, artistic traditions, and systems of social organization. And that was, with each passing generation, being reduced to something that Genesis 6 describes with a sentence that ought to be one of the most disturbing in all of sacred literature. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. The Hebrew word translated as was sorry is nacham, which literally means sighed deeply, suffered in the breath. It is not the repentance of one who has erred. It is the lament of one who watches something precious being destroyed before their eyes. It is grief, not error. It is the lament of a creator contemplating what he loved coming apart in his hands. But there is an even deeper dimension to this narrative that rarely receives the attention it deserves. When you read Genesis from the beginning, you notice that there is a specific promise given shortly after the fall in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 3, verse 15, God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. It is the first messianic prophecy recorded in the scriptures, the promise that someone will come from the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent, a specific human descendant, a lineage that needed to remain intact for that promise to one day be fulfilled. And then in Genesis 6, what happens? A mass contamination of the human lineage. Beings of supernatural nature intermingle with human women, generating descendants of hybrid nature. If that contamination had been allowed to become complete, if there had remained no human being of an uncompromised lineage, the promise of Genesis 3:15 would have become biologically unviable. The serpent would not have needed to attack directly. It merely needed to contaminate the entire field before the specific seed could germinate. It is no coincidence that the text says Noah was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word tamim means perfect, complete, without blemish. The same word used to describe the unblemished animals accepted for sacrifice in the Levitical temple system. And in his generations, Bedorotav in Hebrew may very well refer not only to his moral character, genuine without doubt, but to the integrity of his lineage. Noah was, possibly, one of the last human beings whose ancestry had not been compromised by the mingling described in the preceding verses. One family, in a world of hundreds of millions, the sole remaining point of continuity. The flood, in this reading, was not merely a moral judgment upon a corrupt civilization. It was a preservation measure for a specific lineage, the only lineage through which the oldest promise could one day be fulfilled. The serpent had attempted to contaminate the entire field. The waters were the answer to that contamination. The watchers who descended paid a specific price for their transgression. The Book of Enoch describes God sending messengers to execute the judgments. Gabriel was instructed to destroy the children of the watchers, causing them to war against one another until they were annihilated. Michael was instructed to bind Semyaza and his companions in the depths of the earth, under the hills of the earth, to await the day of final judgment. Azazel was bound hand and foot and cast into Dudael in the desert, covered with stones and darkness, to await the eternal fire. The Apostle Peter, in his second epistle, refers to these angels who sinned as being kept in chains of darkness, reserved for judgment. Jude, in his letter, mentions the angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, as being kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. The language of both apostles corresponds exactly to the narrative of Enoch, and both appear to assume that their readers know this story and take it as factual reference, not as myth or allegory. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in the caves of Qumran, added important layers to this narrative. The fragment known as 4Q180 discusses the Watchers and their sins within a broad theological context about the history of the world. The Book of Giants, found in multiple fragments at Qumran, narrates the story of the Nephilim from different and disturbing perspectives, including the dreams that the giants themselves had about their imminent destruction. One fragment describes two of the giants, sons of Semyaza, awakening from terrifying nightmares and seeking interpretation from Enoch to understand what was coming. Creatures of absolute physical power, sons of angelic beings, disturbed by visions that came from a place deeper than their own power could access. As if, even at the deepest core of their constitution, there was something that recognized the fundamentally disordered nature of their existence. Beings who should not have existed, who on some level knew they should not have existed, and who saw in the shadows of their dreams the shape of the judgment drawing near. And then the waters came. The flood described in Genesis was not merely rain. The text says that the fountains of the great deep burst open and the windows of heaven were opened. Both cosmic reservoirs of water were released simultaneously. The scale of the event was one of erasure, not punishment, like someone who completely wipes a parchment clean in order to write on it again. The Nephilim died. The children of the forbidden unions died. The cities that the forbidden knowledge had helped to build sank beneath the waters. And the women who had lived in that world, who had survived the consequences of the unions of Genesis 6, who had watched their giant sons consume the world around them, who had inhabited a civilization in freefall, they too were carried away by the waters. 8 remained: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and the wives of his sons. One family, the DNA of a preserved lineage, the continuity of a promise that had been threatened but had not been broken. What happened to the spirits of the dead Nephilim is another dimension that the Book of Enoch addresses. Being of hybrid nature, born of an angelic father and a human mother, the spirits of the Nephilim had no definitive place in either the realm of the living or that of the ordinarily dead. The text of Enoch says that these spirits shall dwell on the earth and make their home there, and shall produce destruction because they have not eaten but will nevertheless hunger and thirst, and they cause offenses. A category of being held in suspension, without the capacity to die completely nor to exist in any full sense, and which the text associates with the demonic activity that continued after the flood. The women of Genesis 6 have no recorded names. We do not have their faces, their stories, their detailed choices. The text preserved only enough to understand what happened and the consequences of what happened. But the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scroll texts, and ancient Jewish traditions attempted to fill the silence, not because they were frivolous speculation, but because that event left a mark so deep in the collective memory that humanity continued trying to process it for millennia. Myths of giants survived in cultures that never had contact with one another. The Greeks had their titans, beings of an intermediate nature between gods and men, destroyed in a cosmic war. The Sumerians had the Anunnaki and records of beings who descended from the heavens and united with humanity before a flood that rewrote the world. The Norse traditions had the Jotuns, giants who existed before the gods themselves. The Mayans of the Popol Vuh narrate previous civilizations of beings destroyed because they had corrupted themselves beyond the point of return. Peoples of Melanesia, Polynesia, and the Americas have variations of the same narrative structure. Beings who came from above, who intermingled with humans, and who were destroyed in an aquatic cataclysm. The statistical coincidence of all these civilizations, without contact with one another, on continents separated by oceans, narrating structurally similar variations of the same fundamental event, is difficult to dismiss by any honest method of comparative historical analysis. As if the memory of something that truly happened were too vast to fit within a single tradition, and needed to be preserved in fragments by entire cultures around the planet. What these texts say about those women, about the beings who arrived, about what was taught to humanity in that period, and about what was lost when the waters rose, is one of the most disturbing and fascinating stories that antiquity has preserved, and it has not yet been completely told.